Okay, everyone, welcome to this roundtable discussion on the value of patient input in creating digital endpoints. Really excited to join you to this session because I know it's going to be an absolutely brilliant one. And just for some background to the session, we all know how important it is for patients to have input in the way that trials are designed and the way that treatments are designed. So this is really talking about how patients can have input in the endpoints for those things and how it can be valued within that setting. And actually, Dan is going to introduce all the speakers himself, so I don't need to do that for you. I just want to say a huge thank you to our sponsors. So Dan, I'm going to hand over to you to do your introductions so that we can have as much time as possible to ask questions.
Cool. It's great to be here, guys, to have this roundtable discussion. Really excited to talk about the value of patient input in creating digital endpoints. And you would have seen just briefly the theme of what we're going to talk about is how having that right endpoint is really, really important to increase the success of a trial. So today we're joined by a few participants from different backgrounds to give their views. So first of all, we have Elin. So Elin, do you want to introduce yourself very briefly?
Hi everyone, thanks for joining, letting me join today. So my background's in paediatric nursing, so I was involved in supporting children around 20 different clinical trials and understood some of the challenges in getting good quality data that were meaningful to patients from the clinical side, and then more recently as a regulator, so trying to make heads or tails of the data coming through and how that could be used to interpret the value or the efficacy of medicines being tested in the different patient population. And now as part of Aparito, trying to develop new digital outcome measures and digital biomarkers to convey disease impact. So thank you for the opportunity to join today.
Cool. And obviously joined by Toni. So Toni, to give a brief intro to yourself, please.
Hi Dan, thank you, and hello everyone. Thanks for the opportunity to be here today. I've been involved in the rare disease field since 2003 when my first daughter Lucy was diagnosed with Niemann-Pick disease type C, and I now hold the position of Chief Executive with Niemann-Pick UK. And we've been involved in various different clinical development programs involving endpoints over a number of years.
Thanks, Toni. So I'm Dan Lewi, I'm Head of Business Development at Aparito, but I'm also the founder of a rare disease charity for Tay-Sachs disease. So my experience in endpoints is quite varied now, having working with Elin. So it's great to have this discussion and to get the viewpoint from patients and patient groups and how we can work together to develop an endpoint specific to a community. Maddie, do you want to introduce yourself quickly?
Yeah, hi everyone, I'm Maddie. I am a type 3 Gaucher patient. I also work part-time for the UK Gauchers Association as their project coordinator, and I also work part-time for Aparito as their project coordinator for the Patient Accelerator programme. So I'm really happy to be here with you all today. Thank you.
Great. Well, thanks everyone. So it's good to have an intro. So this is what we're going to the theme of our discussion. We're going to talk around the patient experience of endpoints, the patient group experience, and the industry experience of endpoints, developing those endpoints, and the impact good and bad ones can have on a clinical study. And I think it's really important today we can ask questions and get a great learning experience. So we're all in agreement, everyone on the panel. If you have a question, raise your hand, just ask away. Don't worry about interrupting us while we're in full flow. I think it's going to get a much better discussion. We want that to be the main thing today, not just us presenting our viewpoint. And these are the questions we're going to start on today. So we're going to talk about how things were when we all got involved in this kind of advocacy world or in the industry side of things, our experience in relation to endpoints of clinical studies, why the right endpoint is so important. If we have time, then why should patients be involved in that design process? So the first question or discussion point was, I want to put this one straight to Toni first, if that's okay. How things were when you first got involved in the advocacy world in relation to endpoints and that knowledge for patients and carers, and how things have moved forward to where they are now.
Thank you, Dan. As I said, I became involved in 2003, and at that time we only had one clinical trial underway in Niemann-Pick disease type C. And this was the first experience of working within this area for Niemann-Pick UK as a patient organisation, but also the first foray into this for our patient community. And at that point in time, I don't think we were aware of the importance of endpoints or the impact they have on the outcome of therapeutic research. But in contrast now, with 5 trials now in progress, endpoints are very high on our agenda. We've been involved in many discussions about this subject, and they are discussed and understood by our global community regularly during focus groups, workshops, and at our annual family conference. And I would add that although there is now a broader understanding of our disease and the challenges of selecting meaningful endpoints that can be effectively measured and are translatable to clinical monitoring, there are still huge challenges for our multisystemic disease.
That's great. Thanks, Toni. It'd be interesting to know your viewpoint from the patient perspective, Maddie, how you're seeing things develop over time for you personally in terms of endpoints.
Yeah, so my first experience of a clinical trial was probably when I was back, I think I was about 9 years old. And at that point, I knew nothing about clinical endpoints. And I really saw I didn't really think about the researchers at the time, you know, the people behind the endpoints that had designed the clinical trial. I just remember going to hospital, you know, every couple of months or every few weeks and having lots of tests done. And I think I agree with Toni in the fact that awareness has increased over the past 10 years. I mean, I was very young when that clinical trial happened, and I don't really remember getting much information or absorbing the information, whether I got it or not. But I think that, yes, patients are more aware of the medicine development pathway than they were 10 years ago. I think that, you know, 10 years ago, it was very much about giving out leaflets. You would invite, as Toni said, you would invite people, you know, to come and speak about clinical trials at patient conferences, etc. But now I think that we're seeing an emergence of patient experts and, you know, patients that are really driven to learning more about their disease and really getting involved with clinical trials and clinical trial design. And I also think that researchers are also reaching out more than they were 10 years ago to patients, and I think that's a really good thing.
Great. Thanks, Maddie. I just think from your perspective, Elin, having set up Aparito 2014 to where we are now, from your experience previously, how have you seen things move in terms of endpoints and then bringing in patients and carers?
Yeah, I think while Aparito sort of was set up in 2014, I think the idea of having more patient-friendly endpoints started for me 25 years ago when I was involved in that first clinical trial of, you know, getting children and families to tolerate really long, painful, invasive tests, having parents say, why are we using this endpoint when it has no reflection of what's important to us on a day-to-day living quality of life aspects, and also then ending up with inconclusive clinical trial results because the quality of the data from the children not being able to comply with the test, so there was a lot of missing data. And, you know, yes, you can get a statistical p-value from it, but what does that translate to in an improvement in that child's quality of life or not? So, you know, as you say, 2014 was when Aparito sort of emerged, but the validation, development, utilization of endpoints is something that I've sort of been living and breathing for 20 plus years now in my career. And I think one of the critical things is that we are finally moving towards sort of patient centricity. And for a while, I think patient centricity had still been a bit of a tokenism. So people would sort of say, yes, we're involving patients, but actually, you know, asking them to write the patient information sheets in a lay language when everything's already been decided, it's not really the right approach, because the tests are the same and the implications are the same, whether it's written in a friendly lay language or not. And I think now, you know, with the opportunity that innovation and technology brings, but with a stronger patient advocacy voice, we're able to sort of address this much better now.
It's interesting. I think my experience of being in advocacy for nearly 10 years, and then also clinical studies through the work at Aparito and also the Cats Foundation, is I think the last 5 years advocacy groups are being listened to a lot more. I don't know if that's an experience you've had, Toni, in clinical study design.
Actually, Dan, yes, I would agree with you that we are being listened to, but I would also say that in some of our experiences, we have been at the table right from the outset and talked about this and given our experience and our opinion, but then it hasn't been acted upon. So I still think that there is room for improvement there and for truly listening to the patient experience.
That's the disappointing thing, as Elin was saying, paying lip service to the experience that we all have. I would always say that the patient, the parent carer, has that real life understanding of the disease, especially, you know, the long nights providing the care. If it's a very sick child, it's not when they see the patient in the hospital, it's that time afterwards. That's interesting to see how things have at least moved forward in the last 20 plus years. It'd be interesting to see where we are in the next few years, because I do see the technology developing and endpoints being recorded in a much more patient-centric way. So I thought we could move on to the next discussion topic. If anyone has any questions, please put them into the chat so we can discuss them. We're more than happy to be interrupted as we go along. So the next question we wanted to go through is our experience of endpoints in relation to clinical studies. And I think here is really important to understand that we've all had good experiences and bad experiences in relation to those endpoints being used in studies. So Matt, I was wondering if there's any examples you had from the studies you've been involved in.
Yeah, so I was, as I said, I was involved in a study when I was younger, and I think Elin will remember it well. And as Elin said, you know, these studies are often quite invasive, you know, and having to justify, you have to pick clinical endpoints that justify that level, you know, the level of pain, for instance, you're expecting children or adults to go through, you know, the amount of time they're having to take out, so having to go up to hospital every couple of weeks, etc. You know, the amount of you know, remembering to take, you know, a tablet every day, and, you know, keeping to the rules of that. So I remember I was taking a drug where, when I was younger, and I, for instance, I couldn't eat certain foods and things like that, and I remember having to go up to hospital every 3 weeks, and I was, you know, being prodded and poked, and all sorts of things were going on. But I think that the clinical endpoints that were chosen for that specific medication weren't particularly well thought out at all, really, from my perspective anyway. I don't know what Elin thinks, but I think that, for instance, like, I think one of the primary endpoints was the saccadic eye movements, and I think that was quite a difficult thing to measure. And also, you know, as we've said before, Dan, that sort of endpoint isn't necessarily what the patient wants. You know, is that going to make a massive amount of difference to the patient on a daily basis? You know, as you were saying with your daughter, it probably wasn't something that really mattered compared to other things that were more important. Brainstem evoke response. So this was about auditory processing, and that was quite hard to measure from what I've been told about that one, and difficult to capture. And also, I don't think any of the results of these were particularly statistically significant, which means that eventually the drug wasn't approved. And then I think the last one, and I might be wrong, Elin, you can correct me in a minute, was lung function. And a lot of the people that were having this treatment were children, and it's, from my understanding, I think it's quite difficult to measure lung function in children, so I'm not entirely sure that was particularly well selected endpoint.
Yeah, I would support that. I think there was, you know, many endpoints, and I think terminology that people might be familiar with are things like surrogate endpoints, biomarkers. So they are sort of clinical indicators of things, that physical parameters that can be measured. And from a clinical trial design point of view, those objective data are often seen as sort of gold standard and that kind of thing. But actually, what's important now, and I think people are realizing that asking patients to take part in long, painful, invasive, hospital-based tests that are quite stressful actually also means they can't perform at their best. So they don't, the stress of traveling to the hospital, being in a sterile environment, means that they often can't function or perform the test to the best of their ability anyway. And then critically, making sure that the data is as meaningful as it can be.
Thanks, Elin. I was wondering if, from your experience, Toni, from your years of working at NPUK, whether there's anything you've experienced in relation to endpoints.
Thanks, Dan. Yes, we've had some varying experiences, and I would agree with a lot of the things that Maddie said. Thinking about the patient perspective, one of the primary endpoint in the first trial that I mentioned earlier was eye movement velocity, which was really difficult to measure. And in the end, it did not show evidence of benefit of the product. But the subsequent EMA approval was actually based on another endpoint, which was swallowing, which was not mentioned in the initial trial. And that, of course, it has proven to be much more important to patients. A more recent trial in NPC has failed due to the lack of statistically significant data, although those participating in their trial and their PIs believe that there is a treatment benefit. But this was not reflected by the chosen endpoints, which showed an unfavourable benefit-risk balance. And we were involved initially in that trial design and in the selection of endpoints, and we gave our opinions, but that's one of the examples where our experience was not listened to. And I think it's apparent to us that in such a variably progressing disease like NPUK type C, one endpoint for patients who, despite being in the same age category, vary greatly in severity is not suitable. I think another example of a trial I would just give is a recent one that used a 2-anchor measurement for their primary endpoints, which used the 6-meter walk test and the peg test. And these weren't measured by time, but by precision, and also by the clinical global impression of change. And that's been quite a positive experience. But there are a number of clinical severity scales available for use in NPUK type C. And we were actually involved in doing a survey of our patient community to help inform those and to decide what were the most important areas for patients in that. And we actually came up with the 5-domain scale, which is ambulation, speech, cognition, swallow, and fine motor, which has been acknowledged by patients as being the most important to address.
Thanks. That's an interesting point there, Toni, especially on the experience that we've all had with endpoints. And move on to the next discussion point. So why is the right endpoint so important? And this is something that I think the patient groups, and I mentioned in my talk earlier, we're becoming more and more listened to as patient groups and our experience with the patients. And I think that for me, the biggest challenge we have is to make sure the right endpoint is selected so our trial can be successful. To me, there's been nothing worse than a study that has a drug that actually that works, but because they selected the wrong endpoint, they don't get the data to support its approval, so the trial fails. And in the rare disease space, we live and die by clinical trial design, unfortunately. So if a study does fail in our rare disease, the chances of someone else looking at it could be stopped for the next 10 to 15 years because it's shown that the trial or a study didn't work within that rare disease space. So it's really important that as patient groups, we are and you are listened to, and our advice is sought in the right kind of endpoint selection. It'd be interesting to know what, from the patient group perspective, Toni, what you see as important in the endpoint selection and why it's so important.
I think, as we've discussed really, that the endpoints should reflect the patient perspective and aim to show benefit in the symptoms and aspects of the disease that the patients feel are the most important, and where change would be really significant within their daily lives. And endpoints, thinking about the selection of endpoints, they're the indication of the efficacy of the intervention. So without that evidence that shows disease stabilization or improvement, then you're unlikely to have a product that is seen as beneficial or that it gains approval. And with such a huge unmet medical need within this field, it's really important to get that right from the outset. And perhaps one of the things that we would ask to be considered is that the patients could be used as their own control, which would help with the reference points and the assessment of endpoints. So that's something that we would like to see taken into account in the future.
That's interesting. So Elin, from your perspective, what's your view on why endpoints and that selection is so important?
Yeah, I mean, they're important on multiple different levels. Is one, they're important for the patient's experience of being part of the clinical trial. So things like recruitment and retention and you know, overall managing what can be quite a stressful experience. They're particularly important when it comes to the regulators trying to understand the benefit risk ratio of any drugs. So when we look at the endpoint, we're going to be looking at you know, what's working, so the efficacy of the drug, and obviously that needs to be balanced with any potential side effects. So you know, it's really important that the regulators have the right efficacy endpoints to balance against the potential side effects or risks the drugs. And then I think what we're really realizing now, it's really important, is the reimbursement of these drugs. So when it comes to NICE or health technology assessments, evaluating if these drugs should be paid for on the healthcare and made available to patients, they need to know that that endpoint is really meaningful from that point of view.
Great. And so Maddie, from your perspective, it'd be interesting, with any studies you may have been involved in the past, if you had seen the endpoints being measured involved, would that have changed your decision or your family's decisions to take part in a study? If you understood what was being asked of you as the patient?
Yeah, I do think that it would have had a massive impact on whether I would have taken part or not. Actually, there was a study that became available last year for a drug that I actually decided not to take part in. And I think part of it was my experience with the clinical trial that had happened previously, and the amount of stress that it had on myself and my family, the amount of time I had to take out of school. And at this point, I was also in my last year of university. And I really didn't think that the outcome was going to be, unfortunately, I didn't think it was going to be worth the stress of going up to hospital every couple of weeks. And actually, the initial criteria that they'd come up with to apply to take part in the clinical trial didn't actually match any of the type 3 Gaucher patients anyway, which was actually very disappointing. So they wanted lung function of a certain level, and actually, because we're lucky enough to be diagnosed so early now as a patient cohort, our lung function was actually better, or all patients' lung function was better than that they were specifying for the criteria. And that really didn't fill me with much confidence, I have to say, about the endpoints that they would have chosen, and the amount of the amount of time we would have to dedicate to going up. And also, one of the tests that I would have had to take part in was a lumbar puncture. Now, obviously that's a very painful experience, and tests like this really have to, they really have to be justified by clinical endpoints that are going to, mean something, and hopefully result in the eventual license of a drug. But as you said before, Dan, unfortunately a lot of rare disease patients you know, wait 10 years, 15 years for these trials to come along. And then if these endpoints aren't thought through well enough, it could be really detrimental. But I think I also have to add that one of the really positive things about rare diseases is that we are so close as a community. And, you know, I would imagine it's similar in NPUK and Tay-Sachs, but in, you know, the Gaucher community, we are so close. And therefore, you know, we're a strong patient voice. And actually, when that criteria came out for that particular trial with the lung function, we actually got them to change it. We managed to get them to change it, and that was a really good success for us. So I think that we do have these resources, and we are a very empowered group of patients to get these things changed, and I think that's really promising for the future.
That's interesting. It made me think of a point for you, Toni. Do you think that patients and patient groups are given enough information about the endpoints and the studies when patients are being recruited?
No, I don't actually, Dan. I think much more could be done to work with patient groups and patient communities prior to the endpoints being selected. And from our perspective, given the huge variation in disease manifestation and progression for NPC, it's absolutely crucial for patients and patient organisations to be involved right from the outset. And I also think it would be good if we could take into account the individual patient cases. As I said earlier, it would be highly useful if we could have a sort of an N=1 design that's sensitive to individual variation, which would really help in the assessment of endpoints as well.
No, thanks, Toni. Interesting point. That kind of leads us on to the next discussion point, was why patients and patient groups should be involved in endpoint design and selection. And I thought, Elin, if you can give a very brief overview of the Aparito Accelerator program that we recently launched for those of people who weren't able to hear the talk earlier, and then what we're hoping to achieve for that, that'd be really good for everyone.
Yeah, so I think to go back to the point I was sort of starting to mention before about patient centricity. So we will be familiar with terms such as patient input, patient involvement, patient engagement, patient advocacy, and all these sort of terms sort of can sometimes get confusing at sort of what's patient input versus patient engagement. What we're trying to do with the Patient Accelerator program is to really have a patient co-creation. So the patients start by saying what are the symptoms that are important to them, and then we try and co-create ways of measuring that symptom based on what's important on their quality of life. And through that sort of user testing and co-creation, not only do we hope to identify, you know, a way of measuring the things that are important to patients, but also be able to measure it in a way that's appropriate for that patient community. We're mindful that one size does not fit all. Through our experience, we know that things might work in one patient community, but not in another. So it's important that, you know, we measure the right thing, but how we measure it actually works for those patient communities as well. And I think that co-creation is what we're really wanting to invest heavily in to get it right through the Accelerator program.
Thanks, Elin. I think, Maddie, it'd be interesting to the viewpoint from a patient. How would you think you could get more involved from the patient side into endpoint design, a selection, a study? Any thoughts on that?
I think
You're on
you're
mute,
on
Maddie,
mute, Maddie, sorry.
Sorry, I was on mute. Yeah, no, as over the past couple of years, this is something that I've really been interested in. This is something that I've really tried to engage in. I think I've done a number of things, really, a number of practical things. So obviously, I've attended a couple of training sessions with companies like VRDS, so that's been really good about their drug approval program, so I've learned a lot about that. I've also tried, so in the UK Gauchers Association, I've tried to basically create a group of young patients, and I'm hoping to do a couple of practical sessions with them about, you know, potentially getting involved and sitting on boards within, you know, the EMA or NICE or the MHRA. So, you know, just giving them a bit more information, because I know that, you know, a lot of people have, you know, you have to be prepared when you go in to sit on these panels. And a lot of patients don't even know that this opportunity is available. And sometimes it only gets offered to patients that are, you know, have reached a certain, have a certain amount of knowledge about their disease, and therefore they would be selected. But then I think that's also, you know, it's not allowing everyone to have that opportunity, which I think is also really important. So that's another step that I'm hoping to do in the next couple of years, or the next year really, to get that kick started, because I think patient engagement is really important, and I think expert patients are really important, and increasing that knowledge. And I do understand that some people would rather step back, and they may not want to get interested in these types of projects, but I also think it's important to give everyone the opportunity. And also I think that it's important that everyone's voice gets heard. You know, I think that I'm very lucky and I'm very privileged to be as well as I am, and some of the other patients that have Gaucher present a lot more symptoms than me. For instance, you know, communication is very difficult for them, walking, etc. And I think it's important to engage with them as well, not just patients that, like myself, that are well and able to articulate themselves. Not that I'm particularly doing a very good job today, but I think that it's important that everyone's heard, no matter what stage of their disease progression they are at. Their voice is still important, and an endpoint shouldn't just apply at a certain point, it should apply at every point. And I don't think we should forget the patients that are perhaps at a later stage in their disease.
Thanks, Maddie. That's an interesting point. I was wondering, Toni, from your perspective, how would you like to see patients and patient groups involved in that endpoint designer selection process going forward or in the future?
Yeah, can I just say that I do absolutely agree with Maddie that it's really important for us as patient organisations to emphasise the opportunities for patients to take part in discussions about these topics and the value of their voice in these discussions, and the impact and influence it can have. Some people don't realise that that those opportunities are there, and I think for us as patient organisations, we need to be working with our communities at all times to promote their voice and to make sure that it is involved in all aspects of therapeutic development, but in particular around the endpoints. As what I would like to see is patients, not just patient organisations, but the patient voice as well, taken into account right from that very start, and especially when the suggested endpoints are particularly invasive or are burdensome in time, and that can affect the take-up of a clinical trial or the participation over a long term. So those are the things I would like to see, but also an increase in opportunities for us to have a voice in this process. And as Elin referred to earlier in the conversation, that it is not lip service, that we are actually listened to.
Thanks, Toni.
I just want to say a huge thank you to all of our speakers today. Thank you all for sharing your experiences and your invaluable knowledge with all of us.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.